Welcome to our February 2024 Abbeville Institute Zoom webinar. We've got a great guest tonight, Lee Lancaster from Georgia. He is the author of this great book, The Georgia Farmer Strike, and also Vidalia Onions, which he's got over his other shoulder. Lee works for the Georgia Department of Agriculture. He has a degree from the University of Georgia. He also works with Vidalia Onions in Georgia. In fact, he was telling me before we got on here that why he got involved in that, but we had some problems with Vidalia onion marketing and commerce, and so he was trying to clean that up there in the state of Georgia. And of course, everybody loves Vidalia onions, so that's great. But this is a fantastic book. I saw it in the Barnes & Noble in the local section where I live, and I picked it up and I thought, we really need to have a conversation about this because most people, I think, have forgotten about this. I didn't know much about it at all. And we live in a world where right now in France, we have farmers going on strike there. We've had farmers on strike in Europe in several different places. We had the truckers convoy strike in Canada. And so we've had these blue collar strikes, but people don't realize we had one of these right here in the United States about, almost 50 years ago now, but it's really been forgotten in time. So I wanted to bring him on and talk about his book and, of course, this farmer strike and the larger context of that. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Lee. So welcome aboard, and let's have a conversation about it.
All right, thank you. I appreciate y'all inviting me to talk about the book, and the farmer strike came from a discussion that I had with the Market Bulletin. The Georgia Department of Agriculture puts out the Market Bulletin every 2 weeks, and it's our publication. The Market Bulletin editor and I were talking about the trucker strike in Ottawa, which had happened in 2022. And when we were talking about that, all of a sudden there was, we were talking also, Fox News, Tucker Carlson said something about a tractor coming to Washington, D.C., and I had never heard this story before in my life. Went to ABAC, which is Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College down in Tifton, Georgia. I was in FFA 4 years in high school, Dodge County High School in Eastman. Went to the University of Georgia, was in Block and Bridle, FFA, all of the agricultural organizations up there. Worked for the Georgia Department of Agriculture for 20 years. Nobody had ever breathed a word of any of this to me, ever. And so when we talked about the just looking it up, and the Market Bulletin editor looked at me and said, why don't you investigate and research this thing and get me a back page story for the Market Bulletin? And so I did. On February 14th, which is Valentine's Day, I talked to a man over in Weston, Georgia. This was Valentine's Day of 2022. And he was neighbors with a man named Jimmy Earl Carter. And he happened to be the 39th president. And he was a competitor to Jimmy Carter because he had a peanut buying point, and the Carter family had a peanut buying point. And so he started telling me about a protest that was farmer organized, farmer led, and I went one of my books, and it was like somebody was talking to me in a completely different language, because these things I had never been told before. I had no idea what he was talking about. He said, I flew to Washington, D.C., and I landed and I saw the farmers basically in a prison camp on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. He said, yeah, they took buses and fenced them all in with buses as they drove the tractors all the way from Georgia and Texas and New Mexico and Colorado and all these other kinds of places. And so we got to researching this thing, and there was a 5,000 tractorcade straight up the state of Georgia, starting in Valdosta, which is mile marker 0 at the Florida line. and they drove all the way to Atlanta, Georgia, where the Capitol is. And I think that was exit 246, going 14 miles an hour. You can figure that's a long time. That's about 15 hours if you drove it straight. And so my daddy happened to be in that tractorcade that day. And so I talked to him, and like I said, he hadn't really got down and spoken to me directly about it, gave me anything really to nail down about it. And so that started me getting into researching, and I found a guy's name. His name was Tommy Kersey, and he lived in Unadilla. And Unadilla is not far from where I live. I go through Unadilla all the time, and actually Henderson, Georgia. Henderson's right down the road from Perry, where the National Fair is in Georgia. And so I mean, I had this thought in my mind: I'm gonna go to Henderson and go try to find Tommy Kersey. Well, kind of find out he died in 2017, so that wouldn't have worked out too well. But like I said, these people live so near to me, and I had never heard any of this stuff before. And so I start researching it, and then I find where the farmers movement came from. I mean, it started early. It started in March of '77 against Jimmy Carter. And you think that Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer from Plains and all these things, and everybody just absolutely loved everything that he did. But then when you go into start researching it, it was a terrible time. I don't think any president would have been able to pull us out of this thing anyway. But the farmers were starting to lose their influence on society. They were starting to lose their income, their way of life. And so a lot of them, the only way they could get the people's attention, especially in Washington, D.C., was to drive their tractors on the highway and on the interstates and go to Washington, D.C. And it was incredible the things that happened to them up there. They were up against the wall. There was so many things going on at the time that mirror the things that we have to deal with now. The double-digit inflation. I mean, when Carter lost the election in 1980, the number one issue was inflation. It was not necessarily the economy as a whole, but inflation. Well, we were 10, 11% inflation. You know, the gasoline was 10 times what it had been just 6, 8 years earlier with the formation of OPEC, and we were still trying to deal with those issues also. The farmers were used to getting $7, $8 a bushel for some of their crops. They were now getting $3.50, $4 a bushel for their crops. So they were losing everything. They were, before they could put it in the ground, they were losing money on these crops. You know, so like I said, their way of life was eroding out from under their feet. And also the interest rates were double digit. So, you know, you think about the things that we have going on right now, those same things. People celebrate 3 and 4% inflation. Oh, it's cool to 3 or 4%. Well, you had 3 or 4% the last month. That's 6%. You know, so there's really nothing to be happy about. And so the things that we're having now are very similar to what we were having back in those days. We didn't have a global pandemic. Would be about the only thing, you know, that's completely different from back in those times. So like I said, I would look these folks up, and I would see somebody in the Washington Post or the Washington New York Times or something like that. The UPI, the AP, these people's names would be from Eastman, Georgia, that drove a tractor all the way to Washington, D.C. And I would look them up, and of course, a lot of these farmers have died from old age, but thankfully we have a lot of them that are still around that are my daddy's age and up to about 85 years old. When you get below 70 years old, they were very young people, even though we had 14 and 15-year-old kids on the interstate driving tractors to Atlanta. You know, I would not advise that back then, certainly not today. But you know, we had a lot of farmers, so I would call them. I knew them because of my background with the Department of Agriculture and stuff like that. And so I would call them on the phone and yeah, man, and I would talk to them. There was a farmer who got his eye shot out with a CS canister uh, uh, in Washington, D.C. on the tractorcade in February of 1979. He's still alive. And so I went to Kite, Georgia. And the best way to find anybody is you go to Dollar General and say, hey, do you know so and so? Yeah. And yeah, they come in here all the time. And so that's what I did. And of course, the lady thought he had died, but he had not died, thank Lord. But I talked to him a lot every couple of weeks or so, and it's wonderful. He like I said, he's got an eye missing. He has a story to tell, a tremendous story to tell about driving a tractor from Georgia all the way to Washington, D.C., sitting in a jail for 2 or 3 days, having to go to the ICU, all these things. And he told me, and I think it's still in that book, he said, I'm ready to go back, to do it all over again. And I asked him, I said, when's the last time anybody talked to you about this? In 1981, or something like that. So you're just like, this is incredible. And I mean, it was incredible to me. And I hope that it's incredible to everybody else because it's so important, the struggle that people went through just to put food on the table, to raise a crop and stuff like that. And all of these farmers, I've talked to them. I talk to them every couple of days. They talk to me on Facebook. I was there and they're giving me their story. And it's just as incredible as everybody else's, And a lot of the farmers that I've met, they're ready to go. Nobody's like, oh, you don't need to put that in here or anything like that. They were willing to open up their photo albums to me and it's just like, my Lord, this is you on the National Mall and 8 inches of snow and 18 inches of snow and those kinds of things. And why nobody talks about this stuff anymore? It's strange. But like I said, I put it all together in that book and the Lord blessed me with this book and it's just been tremendous.
Well, you bring up the pictures, and the book is full of them, and they are remarkable pictures. It really is a snapshot almost to a different time.
Mhm.
I was actually born. I was only 2 during the farmer strike, but of course there was a blizzard that year in '77. There was also one in '79 in that area, and I was actually born in that area. So I remember. Of course, I kind of remember that '79 blizzard. I was 4, but um, this is such an amazing story when you think about it in the context of American history. We've Farmers, as you said, you start out saying farmers have been, by that point, you had a really tough economy, high inflation, high interest rates. You think of Hank Williams Jr. and A Country Boy Can't Survive, and that's in the song. I mean, that came out about this time. And so there's certainly a cultural aspect to this too. And that's what I found most fascinating about it. Here's this thing, this really a farmer's revolt in many ways. It's a rebellion against what was happening in DC. And of course, the economic structure of America was being strained and changing very rapidly. And so you think about the populist movement back in the 1890s, and you've got in the 1930s, there was a lot of discussion about these things. Heck, even Jimmy Carter wrote a book, An Hour Before Daylight, where he talks about his father bristling under some of the controls from the Department of Agriculture at that point. And this is actually in this book too, and how they talked about that. Can you talk about that a little bit? Some of the things that were mentioned, some of the problems they were having with Carter's Department of Agriculture, who he put in charge of that, and what was going on at that time.
Well, you think about the um, who was president previously. It was Richard Nixon. Then you had Gerald Ford. At that time, you had a guy named Earl Buts, and Earl Buts told everybody to buy a 450 crawler and tear down every fence, every tree on your place and plant fence row to fence row. We're going to feed the world. And then all of a sudden, we start having grain embargoes, and these grain embargoes have gone on since then. And that was each country's weapon against the other, with the communists versus the capitalist. And those things were going on what Earl Buts had them do basically flooded the market. And when I said about you were expecting $7, $8 a bushel for your corn, and then and then by the time you get it to the bin, it's $3.50, $4 a bushel. Well, that's because we had a sky high amount of surplus, and that was the reason. The reason for that, everybody points to Earl Butts telling everybody to do that. And so when you had Jimmy Carter elected, he appointed Bob Berglund, who happened to be U.S. representative from Minnesota, and the vice president was Walter Mondale, and he was from Minnesota. He was a senator from there, so they knew each other very well. And he had a background in the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service, ASCS, which is now FSA, and it's also split into two things. It's NRCS and FSA. And so he had a background in the USDA government and knew how to run those things. And in March of 1977, Carter told Bob Berglund that he wanted to cut the peanut program by 25%. And so anybody that knew that Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer from Plains, and you say, well, he's wanting to cut the program, that would be like the saying, cutting your nose off to spite your face, because you have so many peanut farmers around Plains. I mean, he probably personally knew 1,000 peanut farmers that I know of, so that I could think of. But he told Berglund, he said, I don't want to have a thing to do with it. Leave me completely out of it. And I want you to find a way to cut that program. And it wasn't because he wanted, to be shielded from it. He wanted to see what Berglund could come up with to be able to trim that program. We only had two subsidies at the time. One was rice and one was peanuts. And all of the Republican and the Democrats, they wanted to completely in their words, get government out of farming at that point in time. And so they wanted to completely get the surpluses. They didn't want to back any of the commodities. And so that was really a big one for us. And then the 77 Farm Bill, they started introducing it. And that was what really got everybody's attention, because you had this thing called a loan value. And the loan value is pretty much going to be your rock bottom, because if you grow a crop and you don't have a contract on it, or if you don't have a buyer for it, you have this loan value, which the government will guarantee you. They'll give you that loan value for that. And that's pretty much what the rock bottom price would be for that crop. And guess what? If I'm buying corn, and I know the U.S. government is going to be buying corn, there's no point in me paying different than what the U.S. government's going to be selling in a couple of days. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to sit on it and wait. And so it started to lower down to where that loan value was. And that's pretty much where everything ended up. And like I said, you had inflation, and you had interest rates and all these other kinds of things. And you had supply, and a complete oversupply of all of these crops, because everybody was growing these foodstuffs, grain and wheat and things like that. And you think about in Georgia, we had the peanut program that we were doing. Cotton really wasn't around that much because we didn't have much going on. Cotton was still being chewed up by the boll weevil. We still didn't have an answer for the boll weevil. And so we were growing corn and peanuts and cattle and stuff like that. And so that was pretty much, we were absolutely getting no help. I say the farmers were getting no help from the USDA, and they were just basically saying, well, we will loan you out of this problem. And they were hoping that this thing was going to go settle itself out in a couple of years. And so in 77, they started with the loans with SBA and Production Credit Association, PCA, and FMHA, and they said, well, we'll loan you some money to get you a loan. And they kept loaning it and loaning it and loaning it. But if it had flattened itself out in 79, everything would have been good. But then everybody was still dealing with the same situation in 82, 83, 84. And so in 83 was when things really took a dive. because all of these low interest loans were coming due, and a loan on somebody's farm that was, $60,000 was 4 or 5 times what it had been because nobody was paying anything on it because they didn't have anything to pay on it.
Hmm.
And that was part of it. That was where the government tried to help with loans instead of actually doing price support. And so that's how it ended up.
Yeah, I mean it's a remarkable story because you think back, you go back to the late '60s, and of course, you've got George Wallace in Alabama and the American Independent Party, and in that I mean that platform, you had a major plank about farming, and a lot of people don't realize that, but this farming was a huge issue in the late '60s into the mid '80s, um, because of the things you're talking about, and of course a lot of this is being driven by inflation, interest rates, and of course, you said there were some problems with drought, pests, some of the things that were also putting pressure on the farms. But in the speeches that were being made in the book, they were talking about, the small family farmers being driven out of business. They're just going away. It's this commercial farming that's trying to drive us out. And you go back to the 1930s, and there was also that same kind of rhetoric being used. We're being driven out. Go back to the 1890s. We're being driven out. And I think by the 1980s, when you have Farm Aid and you have all these things start to develop and all these foreclosures taking place, you mentioned that right at the end. You start seeing by the mid 1980s, you get real pressure on that small family farm. And if you look at today, I don't know what the numbers are, but your family farms are just a minuscule part of the American agricultural section anymore. It's now these big commercial ventures, and I mean, what is that the direct result of this? I mean, is this just something that was naturally going to happen?
Problem, when I talked about going from the mule to the B John Deere to the 4020 to the 125 horsepower 4430 John Deere. You go from, and I was talking to somebody the other day, you went from 1 row to 2 row to 4 row to 6 row. Now you're at 12 row. And a combine when I was a child cost $45,000, and it had an air conditioner and radio and everything like that in there, stuff that we didn't need, and that kind of stuff. And I was watching where a X9 John Deere with the head on it the other day. I was looking at it. It was 100. No, I looked at some. I said, "Oh, it ain't but $260,000." Well, that was the head. And when I say head, that's the thing that goes on the front of the tractor, of the combine, not necessarily the machine itself. And the combine itself, without the head, it was $950,000. They're using combines, like I said, $1.2 million, and the cotton pickers are $1.2 million. The farm land itself just 25 years ago would have been worth, $750,000 an acre, and now you're seeing it go for $2,500 an acre up to $7,500 an acre. One of the things that I always like to look at in the Progressive Farmer magazine is the land watch, because it shows you what land's going for, and you sit there and think, well, what is on a piece of property that the acreages are going for $25,000 an acre? Is there a strip mall on that property or something like that? But you look and they maybe a pivot, a overhead irrigation system or something like that. And that's, the farmers are still individuals, family farms that are on these things. A lot of the land has been going over to these corporations that own the land. And that's just because we can't afford that land anymore, because it goes out of your hands into somebody else's hands, and then it goes into somebody else's hands. And usually there's about a 10% raise in that property. And if I sell a piece of property for $1,000 an acre, and it's 1,000 acres, that's $1 million. And then somebody sells it down the road, pretty soon that $1 million turns into $1.5 million pretty quickly. So that's what has happened with a lot of the properties. And that's the reason why people are not able to not able to make a profit off of this stuff, off of this land anymore, because land has gone up tremendously, just like everything else has, you know. I mean, even you can go to the fast food restaurant nowadays, the things that were $5 for a meal back a couple of years ago was $9.99, $10. And you think about that, same thing, same situation with the farmland now. But back in those times when we were talking about the farm strike, 1983, Massey Ferguson went under. International Harvester went under. J.I. Case went under. Massey got bailed out by the Canadian government. J.I. Case and International Harvester came together to produce Case International, Case IH. John Deere took a $30 million hit, and 1/4, and they're still around. But everybody was taking a hit. You think about the corporations that were around in those days, Gold Kiss, they have completely changed their modes. Southern States and people, and those corporations that were ag based, who were able to provide us with fertilizers and stuff like that. Inputs, I guess, would be the best way to put that. And a lot of those really lost out as well. But I mean, you think about the cost of everything nowadays and double it. And that's what we were dealing with back in the early 70s with the situation with the farm. Everything was getting double except for what you was getting paid. So you think about, if you go to work tomorrow and somebody tells you you're only going to get paid half what I paid you yesterday, and I'm only going to pay you half what I paid you yesterday for the next 7 years, and see how you make it.
So was this, I mean, of course, this was a protest against the agriculture department. So were the farmers blaming the government for the loan system? I mean, or did they see it as a problem with government? Because you said at the beginning, of course, they wanted to, they looked at it as subsidy issue, right? They weren't getting paid. It was a loan situation. What did they really want? Did they want more money from the government? Because the government wanted to get out of the agricultural business, all the subsidies, they wanted to get out completely. What were they actually seeking to do in this time period, this 10-year period, when you had these farms that were, under this pressure?
Looking for parity. And I thought, oh, look, they misspelled party when I first started with this deal. Parity, I had never heard that word before. Parity, if you look it up nowadays, parity comes up in a lot of things. I think parity comes up with free agency and a lot of the sports that we see on ESPN. Parity is basically a fancy word for fairness. And instead of using the Chicago Board of Trade or some of the other boards of trade that we use to establish what your floor price is, they wanted the U.S. government to use a different formula, which was called parity. And parity is what we still use even to this day to set the market value of fluid milk. And you'll see that in the farm bill a lot of times, but none of the other crops are going to be used for that. We use supply and demand on the other crops, and so they wanted to use parity instead of supply and demand, because that was the way that the U.S. government had it set up prior to World War II. They used a formula that figured up. You have a consumer price index. That's what they talk about all the time. Well, we have a producer price index too. So they could figure out how much it costs you to produce that crop and bring it to market. And then they figured out that we put that formula in there, and it'll keep you in business, and it'll help you to be able to make improvements. So there was a little bit of the parity also added a small profit onto it. And then the government said, no, we're already in a recession. We're liable to be completely in a depression if the food prices if the food prices go up at all. And so that was pretty much the government's argument over that. And that was what they wanted, was parity. And they didn't get it. And they want, like I said, that was what they had wanted the whole time. They wanted 100% parity, and then they wanted 90% parity. And the prices that they were getting was about 40% of parity. So basically, you're wanting to get, but I really believe that the farmers, if they'd have said, look, let's just do break even and then go from there with a typical negotiation, if they had been able to negotiate, I think if they'd have said, this is what break even looks like to us, but no, they used parity, and the administration was like, completely no to everything. And because it parity was the word that they just they didn't want to go with that. And so, but like I said, if you'd have looked at it and said break even is this and we're getting this, they would have said, oh my Lord, y'all are going broke. Let's do something about it. But that didn't happen.
Hmm. Now, this was bigger than just Georgia. I mean, you talk about in the book, this was all over. There were people coming from all over the U.S. Talk about that a little bit. I mean, because we think about farmers nowadays. If somebody says we're going to talk about farming, the first thing that comes to mind is Iowa or somewhere out in the Midwest. But this was driven by, of course, the South, which a lot of these agricultural movements have always been driven by the South. But it's almost forgotten about that. We always got to focus on Kansas or Iowa or somewhere else. But there were people in other parts of the United States that were certainly interested in this. Was there, I mean, did those people get involved with this tractor strike? Did they drive to Washington, D.C. too? Was it comprehensive or just people coming out of Georgia or the South?
It started with farmers in a place called Springfield, Colorado. And Springfield is close to, it's Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, right in that area, right in there. And it moved down toward Lubbock, and it's centered around the farmers around Lubbock. And so when you see pictures of the tractorcades nowadays, the tractorcade of 79 started about 20 miles west of the Cadillac Ranch. If anybody knows where the Cadillac Ranch is, over in Amarillo. And Amarillo is on I-20. And so the farmers around Loveland and Hereford and Lubbock and all of that area down in there, that's where a lot of the farmers started out. Lubbock is a huge cotton producer nowadays, and they were a huge grain producing area at the time in the 70s and 80s, and there was a lot of wheat being grown. If you think about Colorado, you think about mountains and stuff, but I said Oklahoma, so you got to go from mountains to the plains, and that was what the beginning of the Great Plains, and so you had a lot of grain being grown over there, and so you had a lot of Colorado farmers, you had a lot of Oklahoma and Kansas and those kinds of folks, but there's so many farmers. I wanted to have it focused on the folks from Georgia because I knew them personally, a lot of them, and I figured I only had 40,000 words. And in my febrile mind, I figured I might be able to do another one at some point. Maybe the Texas farmer strike, if so inclined, or something like that. And so, like I said, Tommy Kersey was such a dynamic figure, and he just absolutely did everything. He and his brother Wendell is still alive, but his brother Leighton was like, I talked to Leighton's daughter the other day. I said, he was like Robin Hood around here. He was like Davy Crockett or something like that. Anything crazy that went on in the farmer strike, Leighton might have been 2 states away, but it was attributed to him, because, and you had a bunch of folks. You had a fellow from Alamo named Tommy Fulford. He was big in the farmer strike too. And so that I figured, I didn't think, well, I'd be able to fill a book up with it, but I figured I'd stick with with the Georgia folks because I knew so many of them. And like I said, I figured we might be able to expand on it at some point. So yeah, it was a lot of folks from Texas, especially, and Mississippi, Kansas, and those areas like that. But I knew so many of the farmers over here that I figured I'd stick with and focus on the folks from Georgia. Because like I said, you get into those last 3 chapters of the book, and that was the death of the farmer strike and a death of the movement itself. And in the very last chapter, the funeral of that last farmer, I really believe was the end of the apathy and the end of that this federal government and folks had, the society and as a whole, they took the fingers out of their ears and started listening because they realized that this was serious. The ultimate sacrifice made by that farmer in that last chapter, they said there's got to be something done about this, and that was the situation right there. So when I talked to, like I said, when I found out about all those kind of things, I would have loved to have done something about, other states or something like that, maybe down the road at some point. But yeah, definitely this was a national movement.
It would be a great, I mean, to have more volumes of this, I think would be fantastic. I know I was captivated by it again because I'd not really read much about this before at all. A couple of questions from the group here. Is there a more standardized ratio of capital versus crop yield to give a sense as to how much change there's been in the farming world? In other words, how many years of crops equate to the investment needed for a farm now? So this is, I mean, we have a lot of people that are interested in perhaps getting in, small farm, trying to do something for themselves, trying to support themselves a little bit, or at least have some food that they can do, or maybe even sell a little bit. The homesteading idea has become popular for a lot of younger people. Let's go out and get a homestead. But what kind of investment do you need for a farm nowadays with the prices you were talking about? You got your equipment is astronomically high, the land is high. So what are we looking at?
The only thing that I can tell you that you can get into on that same scale now that's still around is cattle. And you can still jump into cattle farming at a small investment and make it. There's in the state of Georgia, we have a lot of cattle being grown. We're in the top 2 or 3. I think we may be every so often we end up being the #1 feeder calf producing state in the country. We produce calves. They take them to auction and then they feed them out in the Midwest. So you don't have farms that produce calves in the Midwest for these feeder operations. A lot of them are produced in the state of Georgia by private, family farms like we have. And so that's really the only thing that I can look at and say that, yeah, that's something that you can do and make a profit off of, and be able to actually get some daylight, because you think about the cotton farms, cotton that is our biggest crop. We have 1.2 million acres of cotton in the state of Georgia, and we average about 2 bales to the acre, which is about 1,000 pound, a little over 1,000 pounds of lint to the acre. But you look at the cotton, having to get it out of the field, you got $1.2 million piece of equipment. You're not going to be able to get that, but a lot of the gens will come and pick, they'll harvest it for you, and then they'll put rent, the harvest rate on, they'll get their money out of that. And so when you talk about the crops nowadays versus back in those days, crops are completely different than what they used to be, because we didn't have irrigation back in those days. I mean, we'd had a little bit, but it wasn't a whole lot. Irrigation had just started taking a hold in the state of Georgia in the early 80s. And so your production, really, you probably picked up maybe a third more production than what we had before. And you also had the University of Georgia and places, folks like that. You have new seed being developed that produce more, those kinds of things. And also we have crops that you can have the selective herbicides that'll clean the field up and kill you can kill the weeds without killing the crop. And you also have crops that produce BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, which kills the pests that are eating your crop before it can do any damage to it. So you have, like I said, crops have completely changed since that period of time. But just the investment nowadays, you see a lot of people doing CSAs, and there's a movie that they produced. They used one of the poultry farmers from Georgia. I loved it to death. It was called Farmland. and I watched it. I know one of the folks that was on that movie, and there was a lady that was an organics producer. She had about 4 or 5 acres, and then you had a large grain farmer in the Midwest, maybe Minnesota or somewhere like that, and you had a poultry farmer from Georgia, and it just showed you a huge slice of the landscape of the farms, just to show you the difference between just the operations. But like I said, to be able to get into farming nowadays, I know a fella right now that moved 100 miles into the Vidalia Onion District and started growing Vidalia onions. And he started out by renting, and now he owns a pretty good amount of croplands, and he's having fun and he's doing what he was born to do. So it is possible that you can do these things. It's clawing with your fingernails trying to get things done. You got to get up about 5 o'clock in the morning and put the youngins on the bus and that kind of thing. So it's a hard life, and that's the reason why a lot of people don't do it anymore. It's because it's hard. Um, Sometimes you pray for rain and rain don't come, and sometimes you get rain and the rain don't stop. And that's the reason why farming is the way it is.
You bring up a lot of different things there, and things are going through my mind as you were talking about that. When you talked about rent and land, and of course, yeah, the gins will come out and they'll pick it for you. That sounds a lot almost like sharecropping because they slap a rent on it, and it's like you're working for the gin then at that point. I mean, this is what you're doing, and it's not exactly the same thing, but that's a tough life. And when you go back, and of course, I'm a historian, so I start looking at these things. And as you brought up, the difficulty of it. Go all the way back to the early 19th century. You had a Virginian named John Taylor wrote a book about farming at that time titled Arator. And he made these same points. He said, well, look, if you're going to put bounties on manufacturing, if you're going to make it easy for people to get involved in what he called paper job, and you shuffle paper, people are going to leave the farms and they're going to go into that because farming is hard. So
Hmm.
why would people farm when they can do other things? Now, of course, his appeal was that, well, farming makes better citizens. It ties you to the land. It makes you more heroic, all these kind of things. That there's another effect of farming. And so we should try to maintain this stuff. But the things that you're saying, I mean, you see these and you look at these people that were in these tractor convoys to DC. These are people that had a tangible interest in what they were doing. I mean, they were tied, they were rooted to all of this stuff. It was real to them because it wasn't just about the money. It was about, as they said in some of these speeches, a loss of a way of life. It was going away, and they were afraid of it. And I think that's one of the remarkable things about this whole thing. And here we are 50 years later, and as you said, I mean, you got the organic farmer with 4 or 5 acres, and people are trying these things, and some people can make it. It's tough though, as it's always been. But that way of life has started to disappear quite a lot, and it's harder and harder to find it. Which again, I just found fascinating as you read these stories from the 70s. A lot of the same things that people have been saying for 100 years or more about farming. It really was a remarkable thing. Another question about you brought up some of the genetically altered crops and other things, and um, I have a friend of mine that works in lobbying for agriculture in DC, and he'll say things like, "This, let us farm, get out of the way." He's okay with these kind of genetically modified crops and other things. What do farmers really think about this stuff? I mean, you work in this business. Do they like it? I mean, do they think that is this something that they were kind of forced into, or is it something they've embraced because you can get higher yield, fewer pests, all these kind of things?
Well, you think about Jimmy and Billy Carter. Uh, Jimmy Carter would wake up every morning and they would mop every bowl. And when they got done, they started back doing it again. And before the boll weevil was eradicated, there were farmers going into the field spraying 45 times a season. And you start planting in May and then you start harvesting in October. That's about 150 days, somewhere in there. So every 3 days you putting something in that field, so you're reducing it down now from 45 to 3. So you're not going into the field but about 3 times. And those 3 times, you're not putting insecticides out unless you have something that's absolutely unheard of in a cotton field. I use cotton as an example. Most of the time when you're spraying, but you still have problems. I think that the EPA has started the early process of pulling dicamba, which is a very volatile herbicide. It's 2,4-D dicamba, and that's where a lot of injuries come from for other crops and stuff like that. And like I said, it just things have come and they've moved along. We used to have that Roundup Ready crop, so but people started using diluting it, and then you started having the weeds that were tolerant, and they're like, well, where did that come from? Well, it's from weakening and not using the right dilution and stuff like that, and just a natural situation of spraying 2 trillion plants. One of them's going to make it, and then it's going to get together with another one that is resistant, and then all of a sudden everything's resistant, and so you have to move to another herbicide. But farmers see it as a better situation because you don't have to use tillage, and you don't have to hire somebody else to do the job. And I'm gonna tell you another thing about labor. It's not there anymore. Farming is difficult. It is hard work. I mean, you have no idea how hard a job it is. Just go out in your yard and try to dig a hole with a shovel, and you'll see how hard it is, because the earth will not move by itself. And so you have these huge 200 horsepower tractors that you have to move things with, but they do break. They do break down, and then you have to do a lot of physical work. And so labor's not there anymore. And so it's not just, well, let's reduce the number of trips in the field. We also have to look at the labor situation. And so farmers have embraced these things. The BT stuff, we're on 3rd or 4th generation with BT, because like I said, a lot of the insects have evolved. They actually are tolerant as well to some of the BTs, that the strains that are in the crops as well too. So they have to evolve, and they have to move along. The farmers do too. And so it didn't really increase your yield physically. It did increase what you got out of the field, I guess would be the best way to put it, because you didn't have near as much damage.
I see.
And so it has worked out very well, and like I said, it keeps you from having to do other things, and it helps us to feed the world a little better.
Question about Jimmy Carter. He's, of course, this protest was against Jimmy Carter, and as you said, this is coming out of Georgia. The man from Georgia, the man from Plains. You would think that people would be embracing Jimmy Carter. Have people softened in their opinion of Jimmy Carter after this? I mean, you had a lot of farmers very upset with him. He did get a. I mean, there were people that voted for him. I mean, he's from Georgia, and this is our man. We're going to send him to the White House. Things are going to change here, and but. What is the attitude toward Jimmy Carter now in Georgia with a lot of the farmers that you talked about or talked to, I should say?
Yeah, they voted for him in 1980 too. I mean, we tried to send him back, So a lot of the farmers are still just as hardcore as they were in the 70s and the 80s. And it's not hard to figure out who it was. It's the ones that's in the book. But a lot of the folks, still love him. And they've realized that he had bitten off a lot more than he could chew with the situation. He was dealt a very tough hand because it wasn't just the farming economy, it was the entire economy of the United States, and even the world itself that we were dealing with back in those days, with the interest rates and the inflation. It hit everybody. And so a lot of the folks are still. I talk to people all of the time, and they see that book, and they're like, I love Jimmy Carter. Well, I thought everybody loved Jimmy Carter. I'm like, look, they still do. But there was a time, you know, when they didn't. But like I said, folks are in his twilight days. Rosalind, she passed away right after sometime around Thanksgiving. I think Jimmy Carter himself will turn 100 years old this year. And so people really look at the good. He did hire a lot of Georgia folks to work with him, and Andrew Young was one of them. And a lot of the folks that we know worked for Jimmy Carter on his campaign, both of the campaigns and stuff like that. And so there are a lot of people who still have a really good good opinion of him, and they love him to death. And it's very surprising when they see that and they're like, "What you got against Jimmy Carter?" I'm like, "I have nothing against Jimmy Carter, you know, but you need to read the book."
Now,
Because
when you got to the 80s, right? So Carter loses in 1980, you get the Reagan administration. Did opinion shift at that point, or was it still just the same? I mean, how did they view Reagan? How did the farmers? Because of course, as you said, this drags into the early 80s, and so now you have a different administration, a different perspective. Reagan was able to capture some Democrats that became disaffected with the Carter administration. So, what did they think about Reagan in Georgia, for example? I mean, Reagan won in a pretty good landslide in 80 and then 84. So how did that affect things? Or, this did you mentioned a lot of people still voted for Carter, but did anybody have a different opinion once Reagan was in office or the Reagan administration?
it's like I say all the time, there's a wrong way to see everything. And the thing about Ronald Reagan was he was still in the same rut, and we really didn't get out of it until probably 87, 88. And so when he got reelected, when he ran against Mondale and Ferraro,
Ferraro, yeah.
Ferraro, it was still in a rut because, like I said, 83 had hit, and we were in the depths, in the very bottom of the farming crisis back in those days. But there's a difference. We were speaking to each other, and John R. Block was the USDA secretary at the time, and we did actually have communications going on between the farmers and the USDA. At least there was a perceived communication. You had Marvin Meek. He was a big farmer in the American agriculture movement. He was in the USDA. He was given a position in the USDA. And David Center, you talk about farm aid. David Center was given a job in the USDA. He still lives in Washington. I talked to him a couple of times every a year. He's the one, he and a fella named Willie Nelson and Neil Young and John Cougar Mellencamp, they made this thing called Farm Aid. And if y'all watch Farm Aid, you will see a guy named David Center, and he will have an American Agriculture Movement hat on. And so it's still there. But like I said, that was in 85. And so the communications was a lot better. And they talk about Jimmy Carter wanted to micromanage, and he didn't want to let people handle some of the situations. And that wasn't really the case with Reagan. They all tried to work together and collaborate and get things done. And so, like I said, the situation was still awful, but they were trying to get things worked out and work together on this stuff.
Right. I mean, I'm a big music fan, so you bring up Mellencamp, and of course, you had that album Scarecrow back in the early '80s, and great album, and of course Farm Aid, and it's still going on. There's still Farm Aid concerts to this day, and they still do them. Willie Nelson is still involved in it, and so even though here you are 40 years on, we still have this thing going. And of course Willie, I guess, is about 90 years old now, so it's pretty remarkable that it's lasted that long. But so many things have changed in agriculture. Well, we're up against our time. And I do appreciate you coming on. I hope people got. Let me show you the book. Show everybody the book one more time. The Georgia Farmers Strike. You can get it, or he can show it too. You can get it. I got it at Barnes and Noble, and also Vidalia Onions. He's got that book too. I got this at Barnes and Noble in the local. Of course, I live in an area right next to Georgia, so it was very easy for me to pick this up in the local section. But you can get this on Amazon or Barnes and Noble online, anywhere books are sold. I highly recommend you pick it up. Of course, we do appreciate anybody that supports the Institute. We do exist on your contributions alone as well. So if you like these webinars and our website and all the things we do, think about a donation to the Institute. But Lee, it's been a real pleasure having you on here, and I hope you sell a lot of books. This is going to go on YouTube, so people will watch it even if they didn't come out tonight. You're still be able to see it, and hopefully people will go out and learn more about the farmer strike. And I'd love to see volume 2 about Texas or anywhere else. I think that'd be a lot of fun too. So hopefully you write that book.
Well, I don't want to get too far ahead of the horses, but I went to a place called Enterprise, Alabama on Sunday, and that may tell you where the next book's going to be headed. I don't know. But if
Okay.
there's something in Enterprise that may be like, oh, well, that's where it's going. So,
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to it. When you got the next one, we'll have you on again to talk about that one.
all right. Sounds good. I appreciate y'all having me out, and I enjoyed every minute.
All right. Well, thank you all, and we'll see you for the next one. Have a good evening. Good night.